It started as a regular fishing trip, a chance to escape the noise of the city. Coldwater Lake sat nestled between two mountain ridges, untouched by modern development. It was calm, serene, and most importantly, silent. No birds chirped, no rustle of leaves, just the quiet lap of water against the shore. The first sign of something wrong came when I caught my first fish. I reeled it in, only to find it covered in strange markings, long, thin scars that didn't resemble anything a predator might cause. The fish twitched in my hand, its black eyes staring at me before it squirmed out of my grasp and flopped back into the water. As night fell, the lake's silence became oppressive. The sky was overcast, and the moon barely lit the water. That's when I heard it, a distant cry, faint at first, but unmistakably human. It echoed off the ridges, sending chills down my spine. Grabbing my flashlight, I scanned the shorelines and water, but there was nothing, just the fog rolling off the lake's surface. Around midnight, I noticed ripples on the water, too large to be caused by fish or the wind. Then, slowly, a head emerged from the lake, a pale, hairless head with hollow eyes that reflected the faint beam of my flashlight. It didn't swim or wade. It floated motionless, staring at me. My blood ran cold as its mouth opened, and a guttural, distorted voice whispered my name. I didn't sleep that night, and when I finally found the courage to leave the next morning, I discovered that the markings I'd seen on the fish were now etched into my boat's hull, as if burned there. Every summer, my friends and I visited Blackstone Lake for night swims. It was quiet and isolated, perfect for campfires and late-night dives. That year, though, something changed. We'd always laughed about the old stories, the lights people claimed to see under the surface. Lake fairies, locals called them. One night, after the fire had died down, I saw them for the first time. Tiny, flickering blue lights, shimmering just beneath the surface. Intrigued, we waded into the water. As I got closer, I felt an unnatural chill spread through my body. The lights weren't random. They formed patterns, like constellations. Mesmerized, I followed them until the water reached my chest. That's when I felt it. A hand, cold, wet, and strong, grabbed my ankle and pulled. I went under, flailing as icy water filled my mouth and nose. I broke the surface just in time to see my friends frozen on the shore, staring at something behind me. I turned and saw them. Dozens of translucent figures standing in the water, their faces devoid of features. They were the lights. They were watching, and one of them was still holding my leg. We never returned to Blackstone Lake, but every time I pass by, I see the lights, almost beckoning me back. Growing up near Lake Hazelwood, we always heard stories about the house, the old mansion buried beneath its waters after a flood. People claimed that on moonless nights, you could see its roof just beneath the surface, but no one had ever found it during the day. One summer evening, curiosity got the better of me and my cousin. Equipped with snorkeling gear, we paddled out into the deepest part of the lake. At first, there was nothing, just murky water and rocks. But then I saw it, a jagged corner of stone covered in algae. We dove deeper. The mansion was real. Its windows gaped like empty eyes, and its walls were intact, covered in slime and barnacles. As we swam closer, I felt an intense pressure in my head, like the water was alive and pushing me back. Then my cousin pointed to one of the windows. A face stared back at us, pale, distorted, and angry. The next thing I knew, we were back on the surface, coughing and gasping for air. We didn't talk about it as we paddled to shore. The next morning, I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from the lake to my bed. My uncle always warned me about staying at the cabin near Whispering Lake, but I thought he was just being superstitious. That lake finds people, he said, as if the water itself had intent. I laughed it off until I stayed there alone. The first day was uneventful. I fished, read a book, and admired the peaceful scenery. That night, though, I woke to a soft, rhythmic sound, like water gently lapping at the walls. Confused, I peered out the window and my heart stopped. The lake was closer. I had docked my boat a good 50 feet from the cabin, but now the shoreline had crept to my front steps. The next morning, the waterline had receded, but I was unnerved. I decided to leave only to find my boat missing. That night, the lake reached the front door and a loud knock startled me awake. No one was there. By the third night, the water surrounded the cabin completely. I swore I could hear voices beneath the surface calling my name in low whispers. When I finally escaped by hiking out through the woods, I thought I was safe until the lake appeared in my dreams, always closer, always waiting. To this day, water seems to follow me. I haven't slept soundly in years. When my best friend Adam invited me to Widow's Lake for a weekend getaway, I almost declined. Locals whispered about drownings there, always young men. They said the spirit of a woman in white dragged them into the depths, searching for her lost love. Adam laughed it off, of course. But from the moment we arrived, the place felt wrong. The lake's water was unnaturally dark, almost black, and a heavy mist lingered over it even in broad daylight. The second night, I woke to find Adam gone. Panicked, I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside. I found him standing waist-deep in the lake, staring out at the fog. I called out, but he didn't answer. He just kept moving deeper. I waded in after him, the freezing water soaking my clothes. But something dragged him down before I could reach him. For a moment, the surface stilled. Then I saw her, a pale spectral figure in a white dress, her long hair floating like seaweed. She held Adam's lifeless body as she stared at me, her face contorted with grief. Before I could move, she sank, taking him with her. I fled and told the authorities, but they never found his body. Now, every time I drive past Widow's Lake, I swear I see someone standing in the shallows, staring back. Echo Lake wasn't like other lakes. I grew up in a small town surrounded by rivers and streams, but nothing came close to the eerie reputation of this one. The lake wasn't natural, it was man-made, created when the local government flooded an entire valley to build a reservoir. Beneath its surface lay the skeleton of the old town, swallowed whole. Roads led into the water. Dead trees poked out like skeletal fingers, and on some foggy nights, you could hear what sounded like car horns or voices calling from under the water. The lake always scared me. But when my cousin Emma insisted we go night fishing, I caved. "It's just a lake," she'd said, rolling her eyes. "There's nothing there except fish and bad ghost stories." We arrived around sunset and set up on a small dock that jutted out into the lake. The air was cold and still, and the water was darker than I'd ever seen. Even as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the lake didn't reflect the sky. It seemed to absorb the light, growing blacker by the second. Around 9 p.m., we cast our lines and settled in, chatting quietly to pass the time. The first couple of hours were uneventful, except for the occasional splash in the distance. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere changed. It started with a sound, soft, rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingernails against a wooden surface. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was coming from the dock, but Emma pointed out that it was echoing across the water. "Probably just the wind," she said, but I could hear the unease in her voice. Then came the lights. Small, dim orbs of light began to appear in the distance just above the water. They flickered like lanterns in the fog, slowly moving closer. I counted 5 at first, then 7, then more. Emma and I exchanged nervous glances, but before we could speak, the light started to form a pattern, a straight line, like they were outlining an old road that led into the depths. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the stories of the roads, the ones that disappeared beneath the lake when the valley flooded. Emma stood up, squinting at the lights. "That's weird," she murmured. "They look like headlights." As the realization hit, the faint sound of an engine rumbled across the water. It was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. My breath caught as I saw the outline of a car emerge from the fog. It wasn't modern, more like something from the 1950s. Its headlights glared unnaturally bright, cutting through the darkness as it glided silently across the surface of the lake. "No way," Emma whispered, gripping my arm. The car slowed as it approached the edge of the dock, and I could see it clearly now. Rust covered its body, the windows were shattered, and lakeweed hung from the frame. The engine sputtered and the car stopped, just a few feet from the dock. That's when the door opened. A man stepped out, or at least what was left of him. His clothes were tattered, and his skin was pale and bloated, like he'd been underwater for years. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stared at us with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Emma grabbed my wrist. "We need to leave now." But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the dock, my heart pounding in my chest. The man stepped closer, his wet shoes making no sound on the wooden planks. His mouth opened, and a low, gurgling voice broke the silence. "Why are you here?" Emma didn't wait for an answer. She grabbed me and yanked me toward the shore. As we stumbled to our car, I dared to look back. The man was gone, but the car remained, sinking slowly into the water until only the headlights were visible, glowing faintly beneath the surface. We sped home without saying a word, and I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I decided to do some research, digging through old newspaper archives. I found an article about a family that had disappeared in the 1950s, just before the valley was flooded. Witnesses reported seeing their car drive into the lake, but their bodies were never recovered. I haven't been back to Echo Lake since that night, but sometimes when I drive past, I swear I see headlights in my rearview mirror, faint and flickering, like they're waiting for me to return.